This is my scrappy patchwork Christmas tote bag, which I've made from one pack of fat quarters with 6 pieces of fabric in there from the Craft Cotton Company. It's really simple, it's really fun, and it's a technique that I know you're going to be using on lots of other projects. So let's get making it. I've cut 90 squares of 4-inch calico. This could be any type of scrap fabric. If you've got a piece of old sheeting or something that you don't like or use, then use that, because you're not going to see any of this. So what I'm going to do is to make a little square of one piece of my fabric right in the centre, which I'm going to adhere with a repositionable spray adhesive that I'm putting on with tweezers simply so that I don't get glue on my fingers. And that's going right in the middle. Like so. The nice thing is, it doesn't have to be square. It doesn't have to be straight. None of your lines have to be straight. And I like that, because if you're a beginner and you're not too confident, you don't have to worry about perfect patchworking with this system, if you like. Now, the first piece of my fabric is going to go over the edge here with the folded section. I've got all of these strips which are folded in half and ironed with the folded side facing inwards. And I'm going to put these at jaunty angles. So let's bring the machine in and just start to sew. I'm not cutting them down to size initially. I just want to make sure that the edge of the fabric, they have the square in the centre, is overlapping, and then sew. And then I'm going to lift this out of the way. And as you can see there, I've got one little strip, and then cut that off like so. So I'm going to go around in a clockwise manner with this one. So my next piece, let's do this quite randomly. I'm not matching up colours or anything like that. And again, just overlapping the edge, overlapping the fold, and sew. Snip that, snip that, turn it around. Next piece, overlap the edges. They do get longer and longer as you go, which is fine. Which is one of the reasons why I don't cut all of the strips down to size to start with. Snip that off. Then let's do a stripe and just cover up the edge there. Right, snip there, turn around. The next one can be this one. Oh, folded edge there. And now I'm going to overlap the stitches that I've made here, overlap the edges. And you can start to see the way that this is growing now. See how quick it is? Let's have another stripe here. And this is why it doesn't matter if your stitches aren't perfectly straight, if your seam allowance aren't perfectly accurate, it really doesn't matter. Another one overlapping here. Almost there now, so snip off, another one of this one. Great way to use up scraps this way. Right, these are getting a little bit long now, but everything will be trimmed down so it fits perfectly in a little time. That can go straight over the edge here, so that'll be the last piece on that side. Don't worry that that isn't attached at some point, because it will be in a second. Over that seam line again, save a little bit there. And this one. Another stripe on here, that'll cover over the last of those stitches. I need another one on this side. So I'm trying to avoid putting two pieces that are identical next to each other. And I think now the whole of my square is covered. So I'll just snip that piece off, I'll use that on the next one. And then when I turn this over, I can see that all of my overlapping pieces go right up to the edge. So before I start trimming those off, I'm going to sew on the wrong side all the way around the edge of my square. And my stitches are quite close to the edge of the fabric here, because these are going to disappear underneath the bias binding when I construct the seams when I've finished all of my squares. So this is purely to hold together all of those strips that go around the edge. So that's what we have from the front, which doesn't actually look very neat at the moment. But let's turn this over, and now I'm going to trim back to the edge of the square just here. You could use your rotary cutter ruler and mat to get a really accurate square. There you go. And this one, and then finally here. That's so much neater now, doesn't it, when it's finished? So that's the first of my squares. So I now have 9 of these little squares. You can make as many as you like. You could do 12, you could do 16. Obviously, the more squares you have, the bigger the bag's going to be. I'm only going to put my squares on the front of the bag. If you wanted to do the front and back, obviously you're going to need twice as many. Now, when I join them all together, if I was to use these as a normal patchwork, they would be right sides together, and then when I fold the seam back, I've got a really chunky seam there and it's really not going to work. So I'm going to keep my seams flat, and I'm going to differentiate between all of those squares with some bias binding. So let's sew them together. And the reason we can do this flat is because we're going to use a zigzag stitch on the sewing machine. A long zigzag stitch, a wide zigzag stitch. So put the 2 pieces up together, put the join right in the centre of your foot, and then simply stitch across either side to join them. You're not going to see these stitches, because remember, I'm going to cover these up with bias binding, or you could use ribbon if you wanted to. So now I've got 3 rows of 3, and then I'll join those together in just the same way. I've already joined 2. And just try and make sure that those seams match. This is a lot easier, particularly for a beginner sewer, than proper patchwork, shall we call it, where things have to be absolutely accurate or you're going to notice. This one's a lot quicker. It's a little bit of fun, and it doesn't matter too much if your seams don't meet up perfectly. Right, so that's going to be the size of my bag. This is why I haven't yet cut out the lining or the back of the bag, because I just want to make sure that they're the same size as the front. So just trim off those extra threads. Now my bias binding, and I said you could use ribbon if you wanted to, I've got 3/4 inch bias binding, and I've still folded it in half, and I'm simply going to lay the strips over the top of the seams and then sew. I could use a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch, a decorative stitch, it doesn't really matter, but I'll just show you why I folded it in half, because at its full width I just thought it was going to be a little bit overpowering. Now, if you prefer to pin, or you could tack these in place first of all, or use one of those fabric glue sticks would be an idea. But I'm just going to go back to a straight stitch. So normally if you switch your machine off and on again, it will default back to a straight stitch if you've got a computerised machine. And then I'm going to place this over the top of the seam and sew. And I'm going to sew down both sides, and I'm going to use a long stitch on my machine because this is only top stitching, it's not actually a seam. So I'm just making sure that my zigzag stitch underneath is covered, and we'll sew. Snip that off, and then back down the other side. And we'll repeat this over the top of all of those seams. Just got a join in the bias binding there, so I'm just going to snip that off. So 2 more going across. We're almost ready to make the rest of the bag. And then my last piece comes on here. Almost there. Looking good, isn't it? Make a nice pillowcase actually, wouldn't it? That's an idea. Or a table mat. Or you could join loads of them together and make a table runner for Christmas. That'd be amazing. What else you can do? There we go. Right, so that's how we're looking now. So I'm getting, hello, are you coming up? Come and say hello. Come on then. Come and say hello. That's all you're going to get. Curly tail in the box. Come here. Come here. Come here. You can say hello to everybody. You're a good girl today. So that's as far as I've got. I'm now going to find some fabric to make the back of the bag, the handles of the bag and the lining, and I'll show you how I do that in just a second. Now I've taken my finished front of the bag and used that as a template to cut out a back of the bag to the same shape. Because this is quite firm fabric now, because there's so much fabric involved in that, I haven't put any fleece or stabiliser on the back because it doesn't need it. But I didn't want the back of the bag to be really flimsy and lightweight when the front's quite thick. So I have put some fusible fleece onto the wrong side of the back of the bag. And then I've cut out 2 more pieces from the lining, and they're all slightly different because it's from the fat quarter pack, and I think that's quite nice. It makes it quite quirky. I've also made a strap by cutting a piece of fabric which is 4 inches wide, and that is, didn't measure the length, about 17 inches long. Doesn't really matter. You can make it shoulder length, you can make it handle length, whatever you like, and then fold that fabric to the centre and then in half again. So you've got 1 piece of fabric which is 1 inch wide now. What I've also done, just to tie this in together with the bias binding on the bag, is to put 1 strip of bias binding down the top of the strap. So I'll do that now with the second strap. There. Okay. The handle on the front is quite easy because I'm just going to match up where the bias binding already is, so the handle will sit in the same place. So facing downwards, with the pattern side facing downwards, I'm just going to put a little stitch across the top of the handle to keep it in place. I'm just lining up that bias binding so that it matches. Oh, a straight stitch would be better, wouldn't it? So this is just a tacking stitch or a basting stitch, just so that I'm not having to pin it. So I'm going to wrap the handle over and make sure it's not twisted, and then attach this to the opposite side. So take your lining pieces and we're going to sew the top of the lining piece to the top of the bag. So I'm going to go to a smaller stitch now, so around about 2.5 on your machine. And we'll sew straight across the top. So 1 lining piece, 1 outside piece, and sew straight across. It's quite simple. Over the handles, over again, and off the other side. So you have 1 of those, and then you need another one, so do the same with the opposite sides. So right sides together again. Line at the tops and sew straight across. Now we've got 2 big pieces, outside on one side, lining on the other side, and now we need to sew those 2 together. So make sure, whoops, the right bits are facing, so lining to lining, outside to outside. This is the important bit, it's where the seam is at the top. And we need to make sure that that matches, so you can stick a pin in there if you've remembered yours. And that's where I'm going to start sewing, because that'll be noticed if it doesn't match up. Nobody notices if it matches, but they don't half notice if they don't. And then we're going to sew all the way around, apart from a hole in the bottom of the lining, because I'll need to turn this the right side out. So just make sure that the seams match when I come back, so I'll finish in the same place as where I started. Right, and then we're going to chop off our corners, and that means particularly on the outside of the bag where there's a lot of bulk with the layers of fabric and the wadding, that you still get reasonably sharp points. You may as well do that on the lining as well. Snip that thread, and then we're going to pull this all the way through. There we go, so let's push out, it's looking nice, those corners. I'll just use the end of my tweezers so I can get right in there and push them out. There's one. Toy box again. There's the second one. And then we'll do the same with the lining. That's not so important to push the corners out because this is going to be pushed inside the bag in a second. You need to sew the opening closed in the bottom of the lining. And I'm going to do that by machine. If you pull both edges of that gap outwards, the seam allowance folds in, and then I'm simply going to start just off the edge of the bag and straight across the gap. And off again at the other side. Trim the thread back. Okay, then the lining goes inside the bag. Push that down to the bottom. And one final thing that I'm going to do is to pull the seam on the top so that it sits right on the edge, and then I'm going to top stitch all the way around. So if you have a free arm on your sewing machine, which means doing this, so either the extension table or your accessory compartment will come off, this gives you an opportunity to slide your project underneath the needle, and then I'm simply going to sew all around the top. A couple of reasons for that. It looks nice, and secondly, it's going to hold all of the layers together and give a really nice neat finish. Now be careful when you come up to the seams because they're quite bulky. So take it easy with your machine, and you may have to just help the fabric under there a little bit. If you go at it like a bull at a gate, then you're going to break a needle. So just respect your sewing machine a little bit in that way, and just take it slowly. And the same over the straps. And I'm using quite a long stitch this time, is number 3. Nail it over there, that's fine. So I'm just pulling the outside and the lining again so that that seam sits on the top. Just got a thread there. When I come to the handles, I'm pushing them up and out of the way, and that'll help the handles to stay upright as well. Right, just another really thick seam coming up here. There you go. Remember, if you're using thick fabrics like this, well, it's not a thick fabric, it's lots of layers of fabric, use a denim needle. It's not just for denim, they're thicker needle, or thicker, they're stronger needles for thicker fabrics. So you'll find your fabric's a lot easier to stitch if you've got the right needle for the job. Okay, just over the next handle here. This is easy around the lining bit. And back to where I started. And I'm just going to back stitch just to secure those stitches. Trim back my thread. Come here. Right, so let's neaten that thread here. And my scrappy patchwork tote is finished. I hope you enjoy making yours.